The planet Lenura was known for its beauty, its vast forests, crystal-clear rivers, and colorful, vibrant flowers. The Alvari, an alien species that resembled tall, graceful beings with green skin and delicate features, had lived here for centuries. They were peaceful creatures who thrived on a diet of plants and were known for their deep connection to nature. They had no need for violence. To them, survival meant balance with the planet, not dominance over it. Lyra, a young botanist, had spent most of her life among the towering trees and wildflowers of Lenura. She studied plants that few others dared to approach, fascinated by their ability to adapt to the ever-changing environment. Today, however, was different. Today, she was on a mission deeper in the forest than she had ever ventured before. There had been rumors circulating across the Alvari communities, stories of a new species, one that was not like the peaceful beings of Lenura, the humans, they called them, who had arrived from distant stars. Lyra had heard whispers of these humans, tall, strong creatures with strange habits. Some claimed they were predators, carnivorous beings who hunted for sport. Most Alvari believed they were a threat, their sharp teeth and powerful builds making the peaceful Alvari uneasy. The fear was so strong that the Alvari leaders had ordered anyone who saw the humans to report immediately, but Lyra wasn't sure she believed the rumors. She had only heard tales after all. How could such creatures be real? Despite her doubts, Lyra had been ordered to survey an area far from the Alvari settlements, where the forest was dense and wild. She set off early in the morning, hoping to document some new plant species for her research. The air was fresh with the scent of pine and moss, and the forest was alive with the sounds of creatures hidden among the trees. As Lyra moved deeper into the forest, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The usual sounds of the forest were quieter today. Less chirping, less rustling. She paused, looking around. Her heartbeat quickened. The air felt still, too still. Suddenly, a noise broke the silence. It was soft at first, footsteps, slow and deliberate. She turned toward the sound, expecting to see one of the local animals, perhaps a small deer or a bird. But what she saw made her freeze. A figure emerged from the shadows of the trees. It was tall, much taller than any Alvari. The being had pale skin and dark eyes that seemed to glimmer in the filtered sunlight. It moved with purpose, its body covered in strange clothing, and on its back, it carried something that looked like a weapon. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. This was no Alvari. The figure's eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Lyra's heart raced. She instinctively took a step back, her mind screaming that she should run. It was the human, the carnivorous creature that had been described in the rumors. The stories said they hunted for sport, that they lived off the flesh of other creatures. Was she their prey? Panic flooded Lyra's thoughts. Her first instinct was to flee, but she was frozen, staring at the human who was now slowly approaching. She could hear the pounding of her own heartbeat in her ears. She wanted to scream, to call for help, but her voice failed her. She turned to run but stumbled on the uneven ground, nearly falling to the dirt. The human took a step closer, and then, in a move that made Lyra's blood run cold, it crouched down, as though preparing to pounce. Her mind raced with the worst possibilities. Was this it? Was she going to be eaten by this creature, just as the elders had warned? But then, something unexpected happened. The human raised one hand, palm out, and said something in a language Lyra couldn't understand. His tone was not threatening. He wasn't growling or shouting like an animal would. There was a calmness to him that confused Lyra. What was he doing? He seemed to be talking. Lyra stayed still, trying to make sense of the situation. She had never heard the language before, but the way the human spoke, it wasn't aggressive. His eyes, though dark and intense, didn't have the hunger she had imagined. Instead, they seemed curious. He wasn't trying to harm her. He was observing her. Still, the fear in her heart didn't fade. There was no way she could trust this creature. He was a human, after all, and humans were said to be carnivores. Surely, she couldn't risk it. But then, just as she was about to turn and run, she noticed something strange. The human lowered his weapon slowly, as though realizing that she was no threat. He even took a step back, as though giving her space. This wasn't the behavior of a predator, Lyra thought, but there was something else, something deep in her gut, that told her to stay cautious. She wasn't sure what to think. As Lyra hesitated, the human continued to stand there, his posture relaxed. He made no move toward her. Instead, he glanced around, his attention shifting to something else in the distance, something that Lyra hadn't noticed. A large shadow lurked at the edge of the forest, its movement silent but deliberate. Lyra's eyes widened. The human wasn't the only danger in this forest. Lyra's heart was still pounding in her chest. The strange human stood a few feet away, his gaze fixed not on her, but on something in the shadows beyond. She could hear the faint rustling of leaves as the creature approached. The human was still, his body poised, as though waiting for something. Lyra's mind raced, but she didn't dare make a sound. What was happening? Was the human simply a decoy to lure her in, or was he watching the shadows for some other reason? The rustling grew louder, and then, out of the corner of her eye, Lyra saw it. A dark shape emerged from the trees, large, powerful, and unmistakably dangerous. The creature had glowing yellow eyes, sharp claws, and jagged teeth. It looked like a predator, built for hunting, its fur thick and bristling with tension. Lyra froze, her breath caught in her throat. This was no ordinary forest animal. The creature was huge, much larger than any animal she had ever seen, and it looked like it could easily overpower her. She glanced at the human. He hadn't moved. He was still standing there, as though waiting for something. Was he going to fight the creature, or was he simply going to watch her be attacked? The creature took another step forward, and Lyra's instincts kicked in. Without thinking, she turned and bolted, her feet pounding against the ground as she sprinted deeper into the forest. She could hear the heavy footsteps of the creature behind her, growing closer with each second. Her heart was racing, but her mind was focused on one thing: survival. In the distance, she could hear the human's voice again. But this time, it wasn't calm. There was urgency in his words, and Lyra could almost feel the tension in the air. She didn't know what he was saying, but she didn't have time to figure it out. The creature was gaining on her, and she could hear its growls getting louder. Suddenly, there was a loud crash, and the air was filled with a high-pitched screech. Lyra dared to glance over her shoulder, only to see the human leap toward the creature, moving with surprising speed and strength. He didn't hesitate, but instead lunged forward, tackling the beast with a force that made Lyra's eyes widen. She had no idea how he managed to do it, but there he was, struggling with the creature as it fought to free itself. The human's movements were swift and precise, and despite the creature's size and strength, the human didn't back down. Lyra watched in awe as he expertly dodged a swipe from the creature's claws and then countered with a punch to its side. The creature howled in pain, but the human didn't stop. He moved like someone who had trained for this, like someone who knew exactly how to fight. Lyra stood frozen, unsure whether she should run or stay and watch. The battle between the human and the creature was intense, and for a moment, Lyra thought she might witness something terrible. But then, with a final powerful blow, the human knocked the creature off balance and sent it crashing to the ground. For a moment, there was silence. The creature lay still, its chest rising and falling in shallow breaths, defeated. Lyra's mind was racing. She hadn't expected this. She had assumed that the human was a predator, just like the others had said. But instead, he had fought to protect her. Why? She didn't understand. Was it because of some hidden agenda? Or was he truly trying to save her? The human slowly stood up, wiping the dirt from his hands, and turned toward Lyra. His dark eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw no anger, no fear, only determination. He wasn't looking at her as if she were prey. He was looking at her like someone who had just fought to protect another being. Lyra blinked, feeling a wave of confusion wash over her. How could this be? How could the human, who had once seemed like such a threat, now be the one saving her life? The human took a step toward her, but Lyra instinctively backed away, her heart still beating fast. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know whether she should trust him or run. Her instincts told her to be cautious, but her mind was starting to question everything she had believed about these creatures. The humans were supposed to be hunters, carnivores. But this one had just fought a deadly predator to protect her. The human made no move to approach her again. Instead, he reached into a pouch on his side and pulled out a small device. Lyra watched him curiously. It was small and metallic, with strange symbols etched into it. He tapped a few buttons, and then, without warning, a loud noise filled the air. A beeping sound, rhythmic and quick. It seemed to be coming from the device. The human's face tensed as he glanced around, his eyes darting between Lyra and the surroundings. Lyra didn't understand what was happening, but she knew that whatever it was, it had nothing to do with her. She had been focused on the battle, and now she had a new problem to consider. The noise was getting louder, and it didn't sound good. The human looked back at her, and for a moment, Lyra could almost see the frustration in his eyes. He shook his head and, without another word, began to turn away from her. The sound from the device grew louder. She hesitated, watching him retreat. Part of her still wanted to run, to get as far away from him as possible, but another part of her felt a strange pull. Was this human really as dangerous as the others said? Or was there something more to him? Something she didn't understand yet. The human moved with purpose, his back to Lyra as he kept his attention on the strange beeping device in his hand. Lyra hesitated, unsure of what to do next. The forest around her was eerily quiet now, and she could no longer hear the growling of the predator that had attacked. But the air felt heavy, as if something dangerous was still lurking. Lyra looked around, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. She had heard stories of creatures that could blend into their surroundings, waiting for the right moment to strike. This forest was full of such beasts, but the one the human had just defeated, she couldn't stop thinking about it. She had never seen anything so powerful. How had the human done it? Her thoughts were interrupted by another noise. This time, a low growl, deep and rumbling. It was distant, but unmistakable. Lyra's heart skipped a beat. The predator wasn't gone. It had only retreated for a moment. It was still out there, and now it was angry. Lyra took a step back, her eyes darting through the trees. She needed to run, but the path was unclear. The forest was thick, with tangled vines and overgrown bushes. There was no easy way out. Suddenly, the human turned to face her, his eyes narrowing as he looked in the direction of the sound. He had heard it too. Without a word, he motioned for Lyra to follow him. She hesitated, but the look on his face left no room for argument. He knew something she didn't. He knew how to survive in this dangerous place. Lyra quickly gathered her courage and followed the human. Her feet barely made a sound as she moved through the underbrush, trying to keep up with his quick, confident strides. The beeping device was now silent, but the human's movements were sharp and focused. It was clear that he had experience in situations like this. Lyra couldn't help but feel a little safer with him, even though every instinct in her told her to be cautious. As they moved deeper into the forest, the growls of the predator grew louder. It was closer now, circling them. Lyra could feel her pulse quicken, her eyes darting around as she searched for any sign of the creature. The human seemed calm, his face set in determination. He didn't speak, but every step he took was calculated, every motion purposeful. They stopped suddenly, the human holding up his hand to signal for her to remain still. Lyra froze, her breath catching in her throat. In front of them, just beyond the trees, the predator emerged once more. It was massive, larger than Lyra had imagined, with fur as dark as midnight and eyes that glowed like embers. It was a hunter, a creature built for strength and speed, and it was stalking them. Lyra's heart pounded in her chest as the creature sniffed the air, its yellow eyes locking onto her. She was trapped. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. She glanced at the human, her mind racing. He was calm, too calm. What was he planning to do? Without warning, the human stepped forward, raising his hand in front of him in a gesture that seemed almost peaceful. But Lyra could see the muscles in his arms tense, ready for action. The predator growled louder, its claws scraping the ground as it crouched, preparing to pounce. Lyra felt a wave of panic wash over her. Was this how it was going to end? Would she become the predator's next meal? The human couldn't possibly fight it off. He was outnumbered, outmatched. But then, the human did something unexpected. He didn't attack the creature. Instead, he made a quick movement with his hand, and a small device appeared in his grip. Lyra barely saw the flash of light, but when it hit the predator, the creature immediately froze. It was as if the very air around it had changed, like a sudden force had stopped it in its tracks. Lyra blinked in disbelief. What had just happened? The predator, once poised to strike, now stood motionless, its glowing eyes still focused on them, but no longer moving. The human had somehow disabled it, without causing harm. It was as if he had turned off its instinct to attack. The human turned toward Lyra, giving her a brief glance before stepping closer to the predator. With quick, practiced movements, he pressed a few buttons on the device, and the creature was no longer a threat. It slowly backed away, its movements sluggish, as if the device had altered its will to fight. Lyra watched in awe as the human approached the creature, lowering his weapon and calmly observing it. The predator was no longer aggressive. It was docile, confused. The human had done something to it, something she couldn't comprehend. She had always thought of humans as dangerous, bloodthirsty beings, but what she was witnessing now made her question everything she had been told. The human had saved her life again, and this time he hadn't used violence to do it. The human slowly turned to face her, his expression unreadable. He seemed to be waiting for something. Lyra didn't know what to say. The fear she had felt earlier was starting to fade, replaced by a deep curiosity. Who was this human? What was he really capable of? Are you going to kill it? Lyra's voice trembled slightly as she spoke, unsure of what to expect. The human shook his head, his lips curling into the smallest of smiles. He didn't need to say anything. His actions had already spoken louder than words. Lyra stood there, watching the predator retreat, still uncertain of everything that had happened. The human had proven that he wasn't just a hunter. He was something more. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was only beginning to understand the true nature of the human standing before her. Lyra stood there, her mind racing. The human had done something she couldn't quite understand. He had stopped the predator in its tracks without hurting it, and now it was retreating, disappearing back into the shadows of the forest. The air was heavy with silence, the kind of silence that follows after a storm has passed. But the danger was still there, lurking just beyond the trees. The human slowly turned to face her, his dark eyes meeting hers. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Lyra's heart was still pounding, but it wasn't just from fear anymore. Now she was confused. Her entire understanding of the humans was being challenged. They weren't the monsters she had been told about. This one had protected her, and he hadn't acted like a predator at all. The human didn't move toward her. He simply stood still, waiting for her to make the next move. Lyra took a cautious step forward, her mind still racing. She had no idea what to make of this situation, but she knew she couldn't stay in the forest forever. The predator would return eventually, and the human seemed to know something she didn't. She needed to figure out what was happening. "Why did you do that?" Lyra finally asked, her voice quiet but steady. The question had been on her mind since the moment the predator had been stopped. Why had the human saved her? Why hadn't he attacked the creature like she had expected? The human's gaze shifted slightly, and for a moment, Lyra thought he might not answer. But then he spoke, his voice low and calm. "Not everything is as it seems," he said simply. "Sometimes there are other ways to handle things." Lyra frowned, trying to make sense of his words. She didn't fully understand, but she could tell that he wasn't like the other humans she had heard about. There was a quiet wisdom in his tone, and something in his expression that made her want to trust him, despite the uncertainty still swirling in her mind. Before Lyra could ask more, the human began to move again, his footsteps quiet but sure. He didn't look back to see if she was following, but she knew that she couldn't stay behind. She had to find out more. She had to understand what was happening here. She followed him as he walked deeper into the forest, his movements fluid and precise. He seemed to know the forest like the back of his hand, even though she had never seen him here before. Lyra, on the other hand, had spent her entire life on this planet and still had trouble navigating its thick forests. She was beginning to realize that the human was more capable than she had first thought. The forest began to change as they moved further along. The trees grew taller, and the air smelled different, darker, heavier. It was as though they were crossing into another part of the world, one that Lyra had never explored before. The sounds of wildlife were distant now, and an unsettling quiet hung in the air. Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She glanced at the human, but his face remained calm and focused. His eyes scanned the surroundings, alert and aware of every movement in the trees. It was as if he was prepared for something, but Lyra couldn't tell what. She was about to speak when the ground beneath their feet suddenly shook. It was a low rumble at first, but then it grew louder, a deep vibration that seemed to come from all around them. Lyra stopped in her tracks, her heart racing again. What was that? The human held up a hand to stop her, his eyes narrowing as he listened carefully. The rumble intensified, and Lyra could feel the ground tremble beneath her feet. It was getting closer, and whatever it was big. "Stay close," the human said, his voice low and urgent. "We're not alone anymore." Before Lyra could respond, the trees around them began to shake violently. She looked up in panic, her heart pounding as branches snapped overhead. Something was coming, something large, and it wasn't friendly. The human didn't wait for her to ask questions. He moved swiftly, grabbing Lyra's arm and pulling her toward a nearby rock formation. They crouched low behind the boulders, the noise growing louder with each passing second. Lyra's breath caught in her throat as a massive creature appeared, its form emerging from the thick trees. It was unlike anything she had ever seen before, tall, with dark scales covering its body, and eyes that glowed a deep red. Its claws scraped the ground as it moved, the sound echoing through the forest like a growl. The creature was huge, and it moved with a purpose, searching for something. Lyra's first instinct was to run, but she didn't dare move. She looked at the human, her eyes wide with fear. He seemed unfazed, watching the creature carefully. His hand tightened around the device on his belt, and Lyra noticed a small glimmer of light from it. Was he planning to stop this one too? The creature stopped suddenly, its head turning toward them. It sniffed the air, its glowing eyes locking onto Lyra and the human behind the rocks. Lyra held her breath, her heart racing in her chest. This creature was much larger and more dangerous than the one they had encountered earlier. The human didn't flinch. Instead, he pressed a few buttons on the device in his hand, and Lyra could feel the air change again. The creature's movements slowed, its steps becoming more cautious. The human's voice broke the silence. "Stay quiet," he whispered. "Let me handle this." Lyra barely had time to react before the human stood and stepped into view, facing the massive creature. The creature growled, its eyes narrowing, but the human didn't back down. He held up the device, and the creature's growl died down. Lyra watched in awe as the human did something she couldn't comprehend, something that made the creature hesitate. The tension in the air was thick, but the human's actions were calm, controlled. Was he really going to stop it without violence again? The massive creature stood before them, its glowing red eyes fixed on the human. Lyra could feel her heart beating faster in her chest. She had never seen anything like it before. A beast so large and dangerous, with scales like armor and claws that could tear through stone. Yet the human didn't appear scared. He simply stood tall, facing the creature without hesitation, his eyes focused and calm. For a moment, there was only silence between them, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Lyra held her breath, watching the tension build between the two. The creature's growl echoed through the forest, low and menacing, but the human didn't flinch. Instead, he took a slow step forward, his hand raised as if to signal peace. The creature shifted its weight, still wary but not attacking. It seemed confused by the human's calmness, unsure of what to make of him. Lyra could hardly believe her eyes. She had expected the human to fight the creature, but instead, he was doing something entirely different. He wasn't just standing there. He was communicating with the creature. Lyra stepped forward cautiously, unsure of what was happening. She wanted to ask the human what he was doing, but she didn't dare speak. She was too focused on the creature, waiting for it to make its next move. Her body was tense, ready to run if necessary. The human's fingers hovered near the device at his side, but he didn't activate it. He kept his posture steady, as though trying to communicate with the creature in some way. Lyra could see that he wasn't just trying to scare it off. He was trying to reach it. Finally, the creature took a step back, its glowing eyes still watching them closely. The tension in the air seemed to ease slightly, but Lyra didn't let her guard down. She knew that things could change in an instant. The human glanced at her, as if sensing her fear. He gave her a brief nod, signaling that everything was under control. Lyra wasn't so sure, but she decided to trust him. For the first time, she realized that this human wasn't like the others she had been warned about. There was something different about him, something that set him apart. As the creature slowly retreated into the shadows, the human finally exhaled, his shoulders relaxing. He had done it again. He had somehow prevented the creature from attacking, without violence or force. Lyra couldn't understand how, but she knew she was witnessing something extraordinary. "What just happened?" she asked, her voice quiet but full of wonder. The human turned to face her, his expression thoughtful. "The creatures here aren't all the same," he said simply. "Some of them are more complex. They aren't all just mindless predators. Sometimes they can be reasoned with." Lyra blinked, unsure of what he meant. "Reasoned with," she repeated. "But that creature was huge. How could you possibly reason with something like that?" The human smiled faintly. "It's not about reasoning in the way you think. It's about understanding them, recognizing their behavior. Most creatures, even the dangerous ones, act on instinct. But if you know how to read them, you can figure out how to handle the situation without violence." Lyra stared at him, still processing his words. She had grown up in a world where survival depended on fighting, on being stronger and faster than the predators around you. She had never considered the possibility that there was another way, that there could be a way to handle danger without resorting to violence. "But why did you help me?" she asked, her voice soft but full of confusion. "I thought humans were supposed to be predators. Why did you save me instead of attacking?" The human's expression softened, and for the first time, Lyra saw a hint of warmth in his eyes. "Not all humans are the same," he replied. "We don't all fit the same mold. Some of us believe that there's more to life than just survival. Some of us want to find a better way to live, a way that doesn't involve constant fighting." Lyra looked at him, trying to process everything he had said. Could it be true? Could there really be humans who didn't want to hunt or destroy? She had always been taught to fear them, to see them as nothing more than dangerous predators, but now she was starting to question everything she had been told. "Do you really believe that?" she asked softly. "That there's a way to live without fighting?" The human nodded. "I do. It's not easy, but it's possible. If we all tried to understand each other instead of always fighting, maybe we could build something better." Lyra was quiet for a long moment, thinking about his words. Could it really be possible? Was it truly possible to live without constant fear of attack, without the need to fight for survival at every turn? The human turned away from her, his gaze scanning the forest once more. The danger seemed to have passed for now, but Lyra knew that they couldn't stay here for long. There were still dangers in the forest, and they needed to find shelter before nightfall. "We need to keep moving," the human said, his voice steady and commanding. "Stay close." Lyra nodded, still lost in thought. She wasn't sure what the future held or what she truly believed anymore. But one thing was clear. The human had shown her a different way, one she never would have imagined on her own. For the first time in her life, Lyra felt like there might be more to the world than just surviving. There might be a chance for something better, if she was willing to believe in it. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the dense forest. Lyra could feel the chill of the evening air seeping into her bones, but she didn't mind. The danger from the giant creature had passed, and the human had led her into a more peaceful area of the forest, at least for now. They walked in silence, the only sound being the crunch of fallen leaves beneath their feet and the occasional rustle of the trees. Lyra couldn't stop thinking about everything the human had said. The idea of a world without constant fighting was hard to believe. She had been taught that survival meant defending yourself, and that meant fighting. But the human didn't seem to view the world the same way. It was as if he was searching for something greater than just survival. She had never met anyone like him before. The human suddenly stopped, raising his hand in a signal for Lyra to halt. She did, almost instinctively, and looked at him. His expression was focused, his eyes scanning the trees ahead. Something wasn't right. "What is it?" Lyra whispered, taking a cautious step toward him. The human didn't answer immediately. Instead, he motioned for her to stay quiet and stepped closer to a large tree, pressing his hand gently against its rough bark. He was listening, Lyra realized, listening to the sounds of the forest. After a moment, he nodded, satisfied with what he had heard. "There's a path ahead," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it's hidden. We have to be careful." Lyra frowned. "A hidden path? What do you mean?" The human looked at her, his expression serious. "This part of the forest isn't safe. There are creatures here that are territorial, and they don't like intruders. If we stay on the main path, we'll be walking right into their territory. But there's another way, a safer way. It's just hidden." Lyra felt a sense of unease. She had been raised to believe that the forest was wild and untamable, that the creatures in it were unpredictable and dangerous. The idea that there was a safe path seemed almost unbelievable, but the human had already proven to her that he knew this land better than anyone she had ever met. "Can you show me?" Lyra asked, her voice barely audible. The human nodded. "Follow me." He moved toward a thick cluster of bushes, parting them carefully with his hands. Lyra hesitated for only a moment before following him. As she stepped through the bushes, she was surprised to find that the ground beneath her feet became smoother, as if someone had deliberately cleared a path. It wasn't a traditional path, not like the ones she was used to. Instead, it was hidden, concealed by the dense foliage. If she hadn't been following the human, she never would have found it. The air felt different here. It was quieter, almost serene, and the trees above them were thick enough to block out most of the sunlight. The shadows cast by the leaves made it feel like they were walking through a dream. Lyra could hardly believe they were still in the same forest. They walked for what felt like hours, the path winding through the trees and descending gently into a small valley. Lyra's feet were sore, but she didn't complain. The quiet and the strange beauty of the hidden path seemed to have a calming effect on her. It was hard to believe that just hours ago, she had been running for her life, surrounded by danger. Now, there was peace she had never experienced before. Finally, they arrived at the edge of a small clearing. The human stopped, motioning for Lyra to wait. He moved ahead, his eyes scanning the area with practiced caution. Lyra stood still, watching him. She had grown used to the way he moved, quickly, silently, as though he was always aware of what was happening around him. After a moment, the human turned to her, his expression satisfied. "We're safe here. For now. There's a stream nearby, and fresh water. We'll rest for the night." Lyra let out a relieved breath. She hadn't realized how tense she had been until now. Her muscles ached from the day's journey, and she was grateful for the chance to rest. The human, however, didn't seem tired at all. He was already crouching down by the stream, pulling out something from his pack. Lyra watched him for a moment before she moved to join him. The stream was clear, the water flowing smoothly over the rocks. It was peaceful, calming. She crouched down beside the water, cupping her hands to drink. The cool liquid tasted fresh, sweet even, as it slid down her throat. She glanced at the human as he finished preparing a small fire. He was always so calm, so composed. She couldn't help but admire his ability to stay steady in the face of danger. He seemed to know exactly what to do in every situation. "What now?" Lyra asked, unable to hide the curiosity in her voice. The human glanced up at her, his face thoughtful. "Now we rest. Tomorrow we continue. But for tonight, we've made it this far. We've earned a little peace." Lyra nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. For the first time since they had met, she felt like maybe, just maybe, things were going to be okay. She sat down by the fire, wrapping her arms around her knees. The crackling of the flames filled the silence, and the soft gurgle of the stream added to the peaceful atmosphere. The world felt far away, and for a brief moment, Lyra allowed herself to forget about the dangers, the predators, and the uncertainty of the future. For tonight, there was just the fire, the human, and the quiet rhythm of the forest. It was enough. The morning came quietly, with the soft light of dawn filtering through the trees. Lyra woke up to the sound of birds singing high in the branches above her. The peacefulness of the night had carried into the early hours, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of calm. The danger that had stalked them the day before seemed far away, almost like a distant memory. She stretched her arms and stood up, glancing over at the human. He was already awake, sitting by the small fire they had made last night, carefully packing away his gear. His movements were steady and efficient, as if he was used to traveling this way, moving through the world with purpose and quiet determination. Lyra walked over to the stream, her feet light on the soft ground, and took a drink of fresh water. The coldness of it was a welcome start to her day. She could feel the weight of her tiredness easing with each sip. She was grateful for the brief rest they had taken, but she knew they couldn't stay here forever. The forest was vast, and there were still so many dangers out there. When she turned back toward the human, he was looking at her with a calm expression. It was almost as if he could read her thoughts, as if he knew what she was feeling. She didn't mind. The human's presence had become strangely comforting, even in the most uncertain moments. "Are you ready to continue?" he asked, his voice steady but kind. Lyra nodded. "I think so. But where are we going?" The human stood up and adjusted his pack. "We'll head toward the mountains. There's a settlement there, one that might be able to help us. We can find safety there." Lyra's heart skipped a beat. A settlement. She had heard rumors of such places, but she had never actually seen one. She had grown up in the wilds, moving from place to place, never staying in one spot for too long. The idea of a settlement felt almost like a dream, a place where people lived together, not constantly fighting for survival. "Are you sure it's safe?" she asked cautiously. "How do we know we won't run into more dangers?" The human smiled slightly, his eyes thoughtful. "Nothing is ever completely safe," he said, "but the settlement is well guarded. It's the best chance we have for finding more answers." Lyra wasn't sure what answers she was hoping to find, but she knew she had to keep moving forward. She had seen a glimpse of something different in the human's way of thinking, something she had never imagined possible. Maybe, just maybe, The settlement held the answers to the questions that had been building inside her ever since she met him. They packed up their things and began walking again, following the hidden path through the trees. As they walked, Lyra found herself watching the human more closely. She had so many questions, things she didn't fully understand. How did he know so much about the forest? Why was he so calm in the face of danger? Why had he saved her when he could have chosen to do anything else? The human seemed to sense her curiosity. After a while, he spoke without turning to look at her. "You're wondering why I'm doing all this, aren't you?" Lyra hesitated, unsure if she should ask, but her curiosity got the best of her. "Yes, I am. I don't understand. Why help me? Why help anyone? You said you were looking for something more than survival, but what does that mean?" The human paused, his footsteps slowing for a moment as he thought. "It means that I believe there's more to life than just fighting and surviving. I believe that we can build something better, something that doesn't rely on constant conflict. But to do that, we need to change the way we see the world and the way we see each other." Lyra looked at him, trying to understand. "And you think the settlement will help with that? Will it really be a place where we can stop fighting?" The human nodded. "It's not perfect, but it's a start. It's a place where people are trying to live differently. They're building something that doesn't depend on constant fear and violence. They're working towards something better." Lyra thought about his words for a long moment. Could it really be true? Was there really a place where people weren't just fighting to survive, where they were trying to build something better? She didn't know, but she wanted to believe it. She wanted to see it with her own eyes. They walked in silence for a while, the path winding through the forest as the day grew warmer. The trees became less dense, and the air smelled different, fresher, cleaner. The promise of the mountains and the settlement seemed closer now, and Lyra could feel a spark of hope building inside her. The human had been right about one thing. Nothing was ever completely safe. There would always be dangers, always be challenges, but maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to live without constantly fearing what came next. As they reached the base of the mountains, Lyra felt a new sense of determination. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it with the human by her side. Together, they might just find a way to make a difference, to find a way to live without constantly fighting for survival. For the first time in a long time, Lyra felt like there was a chance for something more.